Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Tzadik Gimel. We are at the bottom of Tzadik Bet Bet. Let me share my screen and we can really get started. Here we go. So yesterday we saw the following dispute. If one sells an ox that turns out to be a goring ox, okay, so clearly that's not what I wanted because I'm going to be using it to plow my field. So Rav says it's a mekach tos, it's a purchase in error, it's an error transaction, and therefore I'll be able to reverse the transaction, give the ox back to Stan, and Stan will have to give me my money back because this ox is not fit for plowing. And most people purchase an ox to plow. Shmuel, on the other hand, says no, it's a valid transaction because Stan could tell me that even though most people buy an ox for plowing, I thought you were going to buy the ox for eating, for slaughter. And so as a result, that's why I sold you this ox. You know, the fact that a majority of people buy oxen for plowing doesn't affect us. And so now the Gemara is trying to prove whether Rav is correct or Shmuel is correct. And we are working through that effort. We had tried once yesterday. We challenged Rav yesterday from a Mishnah in Ketubot. We deflected that challenge. And today we begin with 4 additional challenges to either Rav or Shmuel. We'll, of course, I'll leave us in suspense as to how we're going to end up. Okay, so Tashma, we're the last abbreviation on the 4th to last line of Tzadik Bet 92b. Hamoch, and now we go to the 3rd to last line. Hamocher eved lechavero. If you sell a slave to your friend, v'nimtza ganav o kuvyustus, and you find out that he is either a slave or a kuvyustus. Now there's a machlokus between Tosos and Rashbam as to what a kuvyustus is. The Rashbam, consistent with Rashi elsewhere in Shas, says that a kuvyustus, let's take a look at it inside, 3rd line from the bottom, first word on the line in the Rashbam, kuvyustus, gonev nefashos. It's somebody who steals souls. What's that mean? It means a kidnapper. Yeah. So a kidnapper, that's the kind of person that somebody sold me the slave. Sold me a slave who's a kidnapper, not a great slave, not really a useful slave. You don't want that kind of person as your slave. So
there's Gemara elsewhere that says Masachek Bakubia refers to someone who gambles.
100%, and that's what Tosos says. If we take a look in the Tosos Kuvyustus, 4th line in that Tosos, 2nd word on the line, Venira Keber Shabeno Kanano. The mefarsh kuvyustus mesachek bekuvya, that the definition of a kuvyustus should actually be a gambler, exactly as Ken said. So that's exactly the machlokas, and that's
exactly. Organized crime leader, you might want a slave who is able to kidnap.
I'm sorry, say it a little louder. I'm going to turn up my volume because it's very noisy in here because of the banging of the.
If you're an organized crime leader, you might be interested in a slave who's interested in who's experienced in criminal activity like kidnapping.
Yes, you might, and obviously we're dealing with a situation where
not the majority.
Not the majority, and of course we're dealing with a situation where the purchaser is trying to get his money back. That's the whole premise of the situation. Obviously, if the purchaser is happy, then nobody's trying to undo the transaction, and we wouldn't have a legal case in the first place. So that's the situation. So now the point is that if in fact you find out that the slave is a ganav or a kuvyustus, so then higio, you know what? It's tough luck. You're not going to be able to undo it. The slave goes to the buyer. He gets to him is what higio means, and so it means he gets to the buyer. He does not end up going back to the seller. However, list him mizuyan if he turns out to be an armed robber. Or he's wanted by the government, meaning that the government has already sentenced him to death. Like in the olden days, the signs dead or alive. He's wanted by the government. So in that case, you sold somebody who's essentially worthless. So in that situation, Omer Lo, the buyer can say to the seller, you have, here's the thing that's before you, you keep it. I don't want this slave. Okay, so what do we see in this situation? Resha, in the first case, where the slave's it turns out that is a thief or a kidnapper. My timer. Why is it that it's a valid sale? La mishum deruva haki idnu. Isn't it because most slaves are going to be either thieves or kidnappers or thieves or gamblers, and so as a result, we're following the majority, and since most of them are, we should assume that the buyer understood the fact that he was going to get a slave that's a thief or a koviustus, and so as a result, that's why we're saying that it's allowed, meaning that because we're following like Rav. And so doesn't this challenge Shmuel, who says we don't follow the majority in monetary cases? So that's the Gemara's question, and the Gemara answers low. No, you got it wrong. The whole point is that basically every slave turns out to be either a thief or a koviustus. Effectively, this answer is saying, well, let's take a look at the Rashbam. Well, first we'll do Lav Mishum Deruva. So let's first do the second line, end of the second line in the Rashbam. Lav Mishum Deruba Avde Haki Isnehu Genavim O Koviustus. That meaning that the point is that the question is aren't most of them going to be thieves and either gamblers or kidnappers? Uladas Cain, and based on that, Kano Halokeach, and because the buyer knew that he was making the acquisition anyway, Ukamisha Kibel Alav Dumei Dummy, and so it's as if he agreed to it. So Alma, so we see Bamamona Azlina Basaruba, we follow the majority in a monetary case. Vikashila Shmuel, and this is difficult for Shmuel. Dekeben Delo Azil Basaruba, that he says that we don't follow the rove. So Kapalga dummy. So then we would say that this case is like a 50-50 case, meaning that yes, maybe the guy's going to turn out to be a thief, but maybe he won't. V'im kain amai higio, and if that's true, why should we force the buyer to take this slave? Hare lo haya yodea halokeach shahaya bo mum. He didn't know that this slave was going to have this defect. Ustam lokeach Eved Shapiro Yavzuzi. And in an unspecified transaction, the buyer is going to be giving money for a good slave. Kida Amarnami Lakaman Apire, as we'll say in a moment with respect to a cow. Shapire Yavzuze Umavato Kol Mekach Umemkar. Where we say that any kind of blemish is going to undermine the transaction. So why is this considered a valid transaction according to Shmuel? Given the fact that this is a brisa that says explicitly that in fact we seem to be following the majority, and we answer no. Lo kula hachiyasnu. Continuing on in the Rashbam, Ganavim, that basically all of them are these kinds of thieves, either a thief or a kidnapper. Ukamanda amrle mocher behedja dummy, and it's as if the seller explicitly said it to the buyer, shaharei yodei alokeach shehu ganav, that he should know that this guy is going to be a thief. So that is the answer, and that is the explanation. Now, Tosos here asks,
what is it? What is the buyer that the buyer would have to keep this slave because all slaves are like this?
Yes, exactly. So he should have known. He can't complain about a slave being a thief when he knows that all slaves are likely to be thieves.
Does this matter whether it's an Eved Kanani or Eved Ivri?
Oh, we're definitely talking about an Eved Kanani here. This is not an Eved Ivri. I'm virtually certain that that's the,
Because I'm thinking there are people that say that we have the chumash in Mishpatim where a person can't support himself and he sells himself. You put a hole in his
Correct.
ear and so forth. That's an Eved Ivri.
yes, correct. That's an Eved Ivri, but I don't think that that's the context that we're speaking about here, because we seem to be dealing with a full-fledged transaction. And in fact, Tosos asks a question here, and it's because this seems to contradict the Gemara in Ketubot. So the today's daf is relatively short, so let's take a look at this Tosos. Last Tosos on Tzadik Bet Amud Bet. So the list of Mizuyan, O Muchtav Malchus, Omer Lo Hare Shalcha Lefanecha. Then if in fact it turns out he's an armed bandit or wanted by the authorities, so then you can say to the seller, listen, take back your guy. And what you have is in front of you. Mikan kasha, but there's a question from here. Leperish hakuntra, sheperish perek afal pi, because we have this question in Maseches Ksubos perek afal pi, daf nun chedem and aleph. Gabi had the parek elameata eved kohen shalachum Yisrael lo yochal betruma. Shouldn't we say that that if a kohen buys a slave from a Yisrael, that he should not be able to eat truma, mishum simpon, because of the conditionality associated with the transaction. Meaning, if David Cohn, the Kohen, buys a slave from Stan, who's not a Kohen, right? You're not a Kohen, right? So then David Cohen will want to feed his slave truma, but maybe there's going to be found out some invalidity in the slave, and then Stan will have to take the slave back, in which case the Kohen will have fed truma to somebody who's a non-Kohen and not able to eat truma. So don't we need to worry about that? Umishani, and we answer over there in Maseches Ksubos, Stimpon ba'avadim leika. There is no kind of conditionality with respect to a slave, meaning that it's almost that it's a certainty that there's never going to be an opportunity to have to give a slave back to the original owner. De'ima abrai ha'kachazi. Because if it's visible, then the guy, the problem with the slave, then it's known. Chazilai, the buyer saw it. The imigavai, and if it's hidden, the problem with the slave, my yichvatlei l'malacha. Why would the owner care about it? Meaning, any kind of physical deformity isn't going to make a difference at all. And kabaile and l'malacha kabaile, he wants him for work. So my amra listim mezuyan omuktav l'malchus hanu kala islahu. And when it comes to whether somebody is an armed robber or wanted by the government, the Gemara there answers that in fact those situations have a voice, meaning that no buyer is not going to know about the facts. So perish v'savar v'kibel, and therefore we're going to say that he will have known about it and thought about it and accepted. V'efshar lo markain the behedja amar hacha havi mekaktos. But 1 second, how can we say that over there when here we specifically say that it is an invalid transaction? It's a mekaktos. It's a mistaken sale. Umafarish Hasam Rabbeinu Tam. Now Rabbeinu Tam over there explains Dahanu Kala Islay, as we turn Islahu, as we say that on Tzadik Gimel and Aleph in the Tosfos, that we say that there's a voice. The Kavan Delo Yatza Hakol Milsa Delo Shchichahu. Hey, that in fact, because it has a voice, it's something that's very uncommon. And therefore, below chashin and lahachi. So Tosfos explains not that it means that it's every time you're going to hear, but there's essentially a very high like. Okay, and therefore, Rabbeinu Tam would answer that in fact we're going to say that although when David Cohen buys the slave, he's allowed to feed the slave because it's very unlikely that there's going to be an undone transaction. It is, although it's a very unlikely possibility, it is theoretically possible. And the Gemara here is telling us how that would happen. Namely, it turns out that I did not hear, that David Cohen did not hear that in fact this slave was wanted by the authorities. And so he says, I didn't know. And so as a result, he's going to be able to undo the transaction. Now, the Tosfos continues by asking the following. We say in Maseches Gittin, Itkin Rav Yehuda, that Rav Yehuda made the following takana, Bishtara de Avde, that when it comes to the slave, the contracts to sell a slave, Avda Dinan Mutstak, that you have to say that this Eved is an appropriate slave. Pater va'ater mikol irure, and he is he is not covered and removed from any kind of concern about him. Irure malcha umalachta, and so as a result, he can do the work that is necessary. And so, kolomar eino muchtav lamalchus. If once again, but that would imply that if you didn't write it, afilu lo kasav havi mekaktos. But here it implies that if you don't write it, it's still a makaktos because it seems kedamar hacha. Ella, so the answer must be Ella itkin Rav Yehuda mishum shufra dishtara. That the answer is that in fact, although Rav Yehuda requires that you write it, it is not it's not that if you don't write it, you the buyer has the right to loses the right to go back on it, but rather it's just a way of clarifying contracts, and that's what Rabbeinu Tam offers, and so that is the explanation of our question or a question and answer that Tosfos offers, 2 questions and 2 answers that Tosfos offers in connection with this second question that the Gemara has asked on Rav and Shmuel. So
it says in the that the buyer can return it.
So in the end, the buyer can return the slave if the slave is an armed robber or wanted by the authorities, but the buyer cannot return the slave if he's just a thief / kidnapper / gambler. So if he's a lesser criminal, so then that's expected, and therefore the buyer will not be able to return him. But if he's a major criminal, sort of like a criminal who's likely to be liable for the death penalty, so then that's then he's going to be then you can return it and you can't get your money back. Now it's interesting because we, of course, today think of a kidnapper as a pretty much a higher form of crime, and so as a result, and basically Tosfos, and when this Gemara is quoted elsewhere, right? This Gemara is also, as we saw, it's in Kedushin, it's in Ksuvos. That this Gemara where it's quoted elsewhere, I believe it's when it's quoted in Ksuvos. Tosfos there asks, this is a pretty serious crime, kidnapping. And so as a result, that's part of the reason I believe that Tosfos over there says that he thinks that it's that Rabbeinu Tam thinks that it's gambling. So it does make a little bit more sense in this context to be gambling. Okay.
Even if it's not, even if he doesn't hear about it.
Hold on just a second. Both of you can't talk at the same time. So start with you, Charlie, and then go ahead, Ken.
We forget that kidnapping was incredibly common until about 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was encouraged by governments.
Wow. Yeah. You certainly highlight an important fact, which is that at least to support Rashi and Rashbam on the kidnapping front, it was a very common crime. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And indeed, the Gemara implies that it's a very common crime when we learned in a variety of Masechtot and Nashim about how we deal with women who get kidnapped. So absolutely. Ken, now you had a question.
Yeah, I was a little confused there where Islu, where it says Kola Islu, V'kivan Delo Yatzek Kol Milsa Delo Shchiachi, Lo Chashinin. So Tosus wants to say, let's see, what does he want? That it's not, even if he didn't know about it, he could still return it. He didn't hear that call.
Yes, that's right. He can say he didn't hear the call, but because of the call, it's going to be a very unlikely return to happen. And therefore, we're not going to worry about the return, and we will let David Cohen, who bought the slave, feed that slave truma, even though there's a theoretical possibility that he will end up having to return the slave if he discovers something that's problematic. So that's exactly right.
So he did not hear about it.
Obviously, he did not hear about it. If he did hear about it, if there was witnesses that indicated that he heard about it, well, then the seller would be able to say that you knew and you bought it with the full knowledge, and certainly any purchase with full knowledge would be sufficient to indicate that this that the buyer took it on that basis, and he would not be able to return it.
So when it says he did not hear about it, the lo shchicha.
Well, the lo shchicha is the fact that it's very uncommon to have this situation, and that's why we're not going to tell David Cohen, don't feed your new slave truma, because
it's very uncommon that he didn't hear about it.
It was very well, the whole situation would be very uncommon. The fact that the slave would be a criminal of such a sort that he'd be able to return it as a mekatos, combined with the fact that he wouldn't have known that the guy was a criminal. That's exactly right. That's what's very unlikely to have happened. And because it's so unlikely, we're not going to force David Cohen to wait on giving his new slave truma. Okay. So now back into the Gemara. Question number 3. Now, so question number 1 was on Rav. Question number 2 was on Shmuel. Now back to back to, I think it's back to Rav. I think I have the wrong, I said Shmuel, but I mean Rav. So let's, I'll have to change that on my screen. We're on question 3. So let's take a look and see what it says. So, Tashma, Shor Shanagakas Hapara, V'nimsa Upra B'tzida. You have an ox that was gored, and you see next to that gored ox a fetus. You see and so Ve'ena Yadua, and we don't know Im Ad Shelo Nagcha Yalda O Im Mishinagcha Yalda, whether this cow was given birth before, gave birth to this nefela, to this fetus before it was gored. And so as a result, there's no liability for the owner of the goring ox. Oh, yalda. Or maybe it gave birth after the ox gored it. And so as a result, the owner of the goring ox should have to pay damages. Now we're going to assume here that the goring ox is a tam, is not a muad, has not gored previously, and or has not gored 3 times previously, and therefore is only subject to 50% liability. So in that case, mishalem chatzi nezek lepara, the owner of the ox is going to pay 50% for the mother cow, urevia levlad, and a quarter for the offspring. And so why a quarter? The quarter for the offspring is because we say, let's take a look at the Rashbam, Uravia Nezek Livlad. It's basically middle of the narrow lines in the Rashbam. Because this 50% for the child, which we would think would be owed if in fact we knew that the baby cow, the fetus of the baby cow came out because of the goring. So then, but here we're uncertain of whether it came out because of the goring. So as a result, the cholkin, and therefore we divide it. And we're set Allah hasam, and we're doing it according to sumchus. Ularav kaparech, and we're asking on Rav. So again, I have to change it should have said challenges Rav on the screen. So my apologies for that. So, and we're challenging Rav because why v'amai chashav le mamana muta b'safech aliba de Rav? Why are we going to treat this as money that is uncertain according to Rav? The Azbamona Basaruva, because he follows the majority. So now we're going to pause there in the Rashbam, and we're going to come pick back up in the Gemara. V'amai, why would we say this according to Rav? Lema halach achar rov paros. We should follow the majority of pregnant cows. The rov paros misabros v'yoldos. Most cows become pregnant and give birth to a living cow. So as a result, we should say that with 100% certainty, or not 100%, but with a majority of certainty, we should say that this cow clearly would have had given birth normally, but for the goring, and so clearly it must be the goring that caused the nephila. And so the question is why are we saying that the owner of the goring cow only has to pay for 1/4 of the offspring? So the Gemara answers, Hasam Mishum Misafgalan. There, it's because we are uncertain. And I'll just to catch people up, we're on the 8th line on Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph. Mishum Misafgalan, and we're uncertain. And what are we uncertain about? The Mikama Asa, because maybe the goring cow came from in front of the pregnant cow, and so the pregnant cow saw that the goring cow was coming right out at it, ususa hipila, and because of its frightened state, that's why it miscarried. The ikalamemar, but there you could also say ma'achura asa, maybe the goring ox, came from behind the cow, and gored her from behind, vihipila, and caused her to miscarry. So havi mammon hamuta b'safek, and that is why this is considered uncertain money. V'chol mammon hamuta b'safek chokin, and as we say, with the paskening like sumchos, anytime we have money where we're in doubt about what the situation is, we are going to split it. So Tosos and the Rashbam here debate what's the story with respect to this situation where we'll say that it's effectively mamon hamuta b'safek. So Rashbam says in second line, Hasa mishum de misafgalan, Kolomer la'olam b'mamon halak akar ro. Really, Rav will tell us that you do follow the majority. V'hasam, and in that case, by this pregnant cow that gave birth to the fetus, that miscarried, Hainu taima dechashav le mammon hamuta. This is why it is treated as money that's put aside, b'safek, in a case of uncertainty. Mishum dekinami azlina and basaruva, just as we follow the rove, akasi ika sveka bahach negichas shor lema patre. But there's an uncertainty that would cause us to say that the goring ox should not be liable. Mikama keneged paneha asa hashor v'nagcha, and because maybe the goring ox came from in front of the cow. Umachmas biyususa kodem negicha hipila, and before the cow had a chance to be gored and have the and cause the miscarriage as a result of the goring, the fear associated with the goring caused the miscarriage. Shekach derech lahapil machmas pachid, because that is the custom that animals will, out of their fear, in their fearful state, end up having a miscarriage. Kamo machmas negicha mamish. And it's the same likelihood, according to Rashbam, that you would have for being caused as a result of the goring itself. The kaimalan hamibais chavero pater medine adam. And what do we say about scaring? We say that if you scare somebody, you might be liable in heaven, but you're not liable in the court of humanity. The kol shekein behemto hamavasas lebehemes chaveiro. And if you are not going to be liable for scaring somebody, certainly your animal is not. You're not going to be liable for your animal scaring the animal of somebody else. And therefore, the grama benezikin putter, because we say that indirect damages are not, one is not liable for them. So that's Tosfos' explanation, that essentially that if we're uncertain about whether the ox came from in front or from behind, we can say with a 50-50 shot that if it came from in front, then it almost certainly had the miscarriage because of the fear, and if it came from behind, then it had the miscarriage because of the goring. Since those are equally likely, we have no ability to weigh one against the other. So as a result, that's why it's mammon hamuta b'safek. That's why it's money that's set aside with due to uncertainty, and that's why we'll split it. Tosfos has a slightly different.
But why is it? Isn't it? Why is it a quarter instead of 50%? If it's normally we say chokim, it's 50-50.
Correct, but because this is a tam ox, as I mentioned.
Oh, it's so he gets only 50. So therefore,
exactly.
So then 50, half of 50 is 25.
Exactly, okay. Exactly, and that's why you get 50 of the mother and a quarter of the fetus. But Tosfos doesn't view this as simply as Rashbam, but rather take a look at the first full Tosfos on Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph. Ika lememar mikama asa demivusa hepila. That it came. Maybe we could say that it came from in front, and therefore, because of the fear, it had a miscarriage. From Tosfos' perspective, fear causing a miscarriage is also an unlikely event. However, when you add two unlikely events, they can combine to make it a 50-50 situation, and that's how Tosfos understands. The samach miusa demipilu. We add the minority case of a ordinary animal having a miscarriage, lemiut demibiususa hipila, to the minority of the cases that fear caused the miscarriage. The Isra la Ruba, and through the double minority cases, that will ruin or diminish the majority. Derov mit abrot v'yaldot, that most animals become pregnant and have live births. V'hamachmas negicha hipila, and therefore, because of the goring, that must be why the mother cow had the miscarriage. V'hava machza al machza, and as a result, we're going to treat it as machza al machza. So unlike Rashbam, who says that the machza al machza is based on the fact that an ox that is running at a cow and is about to gore it, and the cow sees it, it causes the degree of fear that makes it very likely that the cow is going to have a miscarriage, and the likelihood of the cow coming from behind and not seeing it and causing the gore and doing the goring and that causing the miscarriage, that according to the Rashbam, those two are equal. On the other hand, Tosfos says, no, they're not equal. It's definitely less likely that fear will cause a miscarriage. But what we do know is there are two unlikely events. And once you combine two unlikely events, that is sufficient to take away a majority situation and to make it equivalent to a 50-50. And that's why we're going to say that the money hamuta b'safek yachloku. Okay.
Well, why does the mother get fit? Why does she get 50 for the mother then? If it's a Tom.
Oh, because we know that the ox gored the mother. That there's no uncertainty about. We'll actually see very shortly that we're going to say that there were witnesses to the goring. It's just the witnesses were not able to tell us whether or not the miscarriage happened before the goring or after the goring. So one can imagine that it was visible from a distance. And so as a result, they know that this animal gored the cow, that this ox gored the cow, and therefore, because there's no uncertainty there, and there are witnesses associated with it, there's not a question. This ox, the owner of this ox, owes 50% of the value of the cow that it gored. That's going to be 100%. The only uncertainty, and therefore we're going to split the difference, is with respect to the fetus. Okay.
So, but it's a short term. So he gets the
Correct.
50%.
Exactly. And that's why the mother, we pay 50% of the damages.
And the Vlad gets a quarter because
it's 50% of the 50%.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So now we get to the fourth question. I got to remember to change that. It should have been challenged Rav on the screen. So again, my apologies for that typo. Okay. So question number 4, maybe we can say that actually there's a brisa that shows lema katanai, right? So we're now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 lines down on Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph, middle of the line. Lema Kitanai. Maybe we should say that this machlokas is a machlokas Tanaim. Sure, Shahaya Roa, because listen to the following brisa. If you have an ox grazing, the Nimtza Shor Harug Batsido, and you see an ox that was killed next to it. Even though this ox that was dead was gored, and the ox that is grazing next to it has been found to be a muad ox with respect to goring, or maybe the ox that is dead was bitten to death, and the ox at its neck, that was grazing right by it, is one that has been found to bite on multiple occasions, and therefore is muad with respect to biting. We don't say that this ox that is next to it, that due to its proximity, we effectively say that for sure this must have been the ox that gored it or bit it. Okay, and let's take a look at Rashbam. Ein Omrim. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 lines down in the widest lines of the Rashbam, end of the line. We don't say the Rabbanan, that the rabbis, this is the Tanakama viewpoint in this brisa, the Rabbanan lo azli basar umdina. We're not going to go just based on the circumstances, basically circumstantial evidence. And so therefore, when you have even lo havi, we won't even say that this constitutes money that is set aside because of an uncertainty. L'shalume palga, that the owner of the goring ox should have to pay half, because there's no witnesses that actually tie the ox to the gored dead ox, because there's only proximity, and that is no kind of testimony at all. Daman lemalan shazen nagcho. Who knows that whether this one actually did the goring? There are millions of other oxen out there in the world. Oh, you might be thinking, and Rashbam is heading you off at the pass, well, what's the difference between this case and the last case where we saw that there was a pregnant cow that had the miscarriage, and where we do say that it's considered mammon amuta b'safek, and therefore the owner of the goring ox needs to pay 50%. Ve'ein anu yodim im nagach es havlad im lav, and we don't know whether effectively the goring ox gored the child too, and therefore caused the miscarriage, or whether the miscarriage happened beforehand. Va'afilu hachi mechayvin le palga. And yet, nonetheless, the owner of the ox in that situation, which we just dealt with, has to pay 50% of the vlad. To hasam hainu taima. Here's the reason why there is liability. Shahari roin shenagach asapara. We know with 100% certainty, because of the witnesses, that the ox in that situation gored the mom. The Hamid para al cheskasa. And now we're going to establish that cow in its chazaka situation. And the chazaka of that cow's situation was that it was pregnant. And now, when we find that it's been gored, we see that it's got a fetus next to it. So we know that somehow, in connection with the goring, this happened. And our only question, as we saw a moment ago, is did the cow come from the front and therefore it was scared and have the miscarriage? Or did it come from the back and therefore it also did the goring and the miscarriage happened after? So that's the important qualification that that we make. So now we've got the question. So so that's the situation of the Tanakama. The Tanakama says that we don't follow the umdana. We don't follow the circumstantial evidence. Rabbi Akka says we are going to follow the circumstantial evidence, and he changes the case to emphasize it. Gamal ha'ocher, if you have a camel in heat, bein hagamalim, that's among other camels, v'nimtza gamal harach b'resido, and you find another camel that was killed next to it, b'yadua shezeh hargo, then we know that this is the one that killed it, because Rashbam explains that animals in heat are going to, that camels in heat are going to be likely to kick and do kind of and do damage. And Tosos explains, take a look at the third Tosos, I guess it's the second full Tosos on Tzad Gimel Aleph. We'll just look at the beginning of it. Hadanaka Gamal, the fact that we reference a camel, the low nakat shore, and we don't talk about the ox, the Iribe Tanakama, which Tanakama was talking about, Rabusa. It's coming to teach us something extra. Ashma'inan, for us to hear. Dafilu Gamal, Shitsanua B'tashmisha. Even camels, which, are very modest in their having of relations. Talinan Bey, we are going to attribute the damage to this camel, Kaven Shaboet B'Shah Sha'uchar, because they kick at the time and they trample at the time that they are in heat. And so as a result, we are going to say that we do follow the umdana, as Rashbam says, beginning words in the Rashbam, again, now about a couple lines up from the middle of the wide lines in the Rashbam. Rabbi Akka Omer, Basar umdana azil. We do follow the circumstantial evidence and what's likely to have been the case. Ubidine mamanos, in monetary matters. V'hachi amrina b'Sanhedrin b'perak echad dine mamanos, and that's exactly what we say in Sanhedrin. So now that we have this,
but
so
this is
now
not a perfect comparison, because this cow, this ox, standing next to the cow, we don't know that this particular ox was in heat. I mean, okay, the camel goes wild, but the ox is standing next to another.
No. But what we do know about the ox, very, very important. So thank you for clarifying it. What we do know about that ox is that ox was a muad ox. It was a one that has gored before. And so according to Rabbi Akka, we are definitely going to attribute the goring to the goring ox because that's first of all, it's the one that's present. It's proximate. It's right next to it. And it has a history of goring. So all aspects point to this ox being the right ox. So now the question is how do we tie the Tanakama and Rabbi Akka to Rav and Shmuel? So here's how we're going to do it. Savrua deruba v'chazaka ki hadre ninhu. We're going to assume that Rov and chazaka, meaning what is the most likely situation, are going to be tied together. Lema Rav de Amar Rabbi Akka, that Rav would say, like Rabbi Akka, that we follow the majority and we follow the chazaka. So we're going to assume that this camel, which is in heat, killed the one next to it. And more importantly, we're going to assume that the goring ox killed the one that was right next to it. Shmuel de Amar Katanakama. And Shmuel would say, no, we don't follow the majority. And so similarly, just like the Tanna Kama doesn't follow the majority, he would say that maybe there's some other ox that did the goring. So Amar Lach Rav would say, no, I'm not going to. You cannot tie me only to Rabbi Acha. I could even be like the rabbis in that brisa. Because Ana de Amri, Afilu Tanakama, I can be like the Tanakama. Because the Tanakama would say, Ad kan lo akamer Tanakama hasam ela dolo azlina basar chazak. Because over there, all we're saying is that we're not going to follow the chazaka of this muad ox being the one that gored here. Because we don't really know what happened. Aval basar ruba, but if we actually had a majority of cases where it would be a situation of majority, well then azlinan, we would follow it. And as Rashbam explains, basaruba azlinan. So this is 1, 2, 3 from the bottom of the Rashbam. It's about 13 lines up. Deruba adif michazaka, that Rashbam says and explains, according to Rav, that a rove is stronger than a chazaka. V'ika lamemar dero shvarim sheba'olam nachuhu v'lekach pater. And we could say in that situation that the rabbis would say, the Tanakama would say, Rav would say that the Tanakama, even though they agree that usually we follow rove, here the rove is going to defeat a chazaka. And so as a result, the rove animals, if we were to ask, what are the full range of possible oxen that could have done this goring? Well, there are a very large number of oxen that aren't right here and aren't this ox that is a muad. So as a result, we'll follow the majority. And therefore, the majority says, according to the Tanakama, we are not going to make you liable. Ushmuel Amrlach, and Shmuel would say, Ana da Amri afilu de Rabbi Acha. I can go even with Rabbi Acha, because Rabbi Acha would say, Ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Acha hasam ela da azlina basar chazaka. When you've got a chazaka like the chazaka that's associated with a trampling, kicking camel, or an ox that is known to be goring, so then dehu gufei muchsa. We have the animal right here. It's right in front of us. So as a result, that's why we're going to presume that it's the killing animal. Aval basaruba, but would we follow a rove that's a theoretical that we don't actually have in front of us? Lo azlina, and then we wouldn't go. As Rashbam explains, to have a gufe muchsak, this animal itself is right here, and we have a chazaka. The kevan dehu omed bitzido, because of its proximity and standing right next to it, azlina and basar umdana. That's the situation where we'll go after the chazaka after the clear circumstantial evidence. Aval basar ruba. But when we have the lesa kaman, but if you're going to ask me to follow the road where it isn't actually right in front of us, it's not like where you have 3 cows in a pen, and 2 of them are owned by me, and 1 of them is owned by Stan, and 1 of them gored your cow. So the 3 of us have oxen, and the 2 of us have oxen. I have 2, and he has 1. And we can say in that situation, well, a majority of the ones that are in front of us belong to me. So therefore, maybe we would go after the rove. But here, you don't have the other oxen aren't in front of us. The only ox we have in front of us is the ox that has a chazaka of goring. And so therefore, in that situation, we will follow it. So as a result, effort number 4 to try and say that this is a machlokas tanoim did not work. So now we go to effort number 5. Boy, this Gadaf has taken a lot longer than I expected. So Tashma, Hamokar Peiros L'Chavero. So you sell that's, and now finally we get to our Mishnah, which is why we brought this whole machlokas in the first place. So our Mishnah says that if you sell fruit to your friend Uzra'an and you plant them, V'lo Tzamcho, and they don't grow, they don't blossom, V'afilu Zera Pishtan, even if it's flaxseed, Eino Chaya B'Achriyusan. you're not chayiv for you're not liable. My afilu, what does we mean afilu? Why does it say even flaxseed? Lav afilu zera pishtan deruba lazriya zamne. Isn't it the point that we would say that because flaxseed, the most people are buying those seeds in order to plant.
I cook with flax seeds all the time.
Well, I know, but still, the most people are, at least in the Gemara's time, clearly the Gemara believes that most people were buying it, and we're going to get to your point in just a moment. Most people, most flaxseed that is purchased in order to plant it, in order to get new flax, in order to make cloth. All right, so Tanaihi. So isn't that a clear challenge to Rav and a refutation of him? And we actually admit, yes, Rav is inconsistent with our Mishnah. Tanaihi, we're going to say that Rav has to be consistent with another Tana, and Rav would disagree with our Mishnah. The Tanya, because we have a brisa, Hamocher Peres L'Chaveiro Uzra on below Samcho, that if in fact you sell seeds, produce, and it doesn't, and the person plants it and it doesn't grow, Zar Onigina She'ein Nechal. And if what was sold were garden seeds that are not edible, Chaya Bachar the seller is responsible. Zera Pishtan. However, if it is flaxseed, well then Eino Chaya Bachar Yusan. The Tanakama says you're not liable. Rabbi Yossi says, as we turn to Tzaddik Gimel Amabet, Nosin Lo Demei Zara. You'll have to pay for the amount of the seed. Amru Lo, they said to him. Now, who the they is we're going to end up saying that this is a third opinion. Harbe Lokin Oso L'dvar Macherim. But 1 second, many people purchase it for other purposes. And the Rashbam explains, because we're going long, we won't do it inside, but the Rashbam explains that really what's going on here is the fact that a majority of purchasers purchase it for things like Charlie says, for food, for medicine, etc. But a majority of the seeds themselves are used for planting. So according to Rabbi Yossi, we're going to follow the majority of the usage, and the majority of the usage is for seeds. And so if somebody comes along and purchases it and tries to use it as a seed and it doesn't work, Rabbi Yossi is going to say that you need to pay for that. The Amrulo position says no, you follow the majority of customers, and the majority of customers who buy very small amounts, obviously, are using it for food. So that's why you should be liable. So Montanai. Now, we just gave 3 different opinions. So who are the 2 opinions that we're going to align with Rav and Shmuel? Aliba Rabbi Yossi v'Amrulo. Ilema Rabbi Yossi v'Amrulo. If you say that it's Rabbi Yossi and the last opinion of the Amrulo, Tarvayu Basaruba Azle. They both seem to follow the majority, meaning just like Rav, neither of them seems to follow Shmuel. Mar Azil Basar Ruba de Inche. The they follows the majority of the customers. Umar Azil Basar Ruba Dizriya. And Rabbi Yossi follows the majority of what the seeds are used for, which is for planting. Ella itanakama Rabbi Yossi. So itanakama v'amrulo. So rather, the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel is reflected in the machlokas between either the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi or the Tanakama and the Amrulo position. And so as a result, that's what we're talking about when we say that there's actually a machlokas between Shmuel and Rav that is a Tanaic Mishmachlokas. So Tan Rabban, let's get to the Mishnah and then we'll conclude. So now we have Mao Nosin Lo. What in this brisa is so Ma Nosin Lo? What do you have to pay back? Meaning, what's the damages? I sold you the produce stand and you planted it and it didn't blossom, and now you come back and want me to pay you back. So according to the Tanakama, Demei Zera v'lo hotza, I have to pay you the amount you paid me. I return your money to you. That's it. I don't have to pay your expenses. The Yesh Omrim says no. Af hotza, I even have to pay your expenses, as the Rashbam explains that I have to pay for whatever you spent on plowing and for hiring workers. All of that I'm going to be liable for. Basically, I'm liable for consequential damages. Man Yesh Omrim. So who is this Yesh Omrim? Amar Rav Chisda, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. It's Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Ha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Well, what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is it? Elam and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel demasticin. You want to say it's the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel in our Mishnah? Titan hamocher peres lechavero uzra'an velot samchu v'afilu zera pishnan eno chay b'achur yusan. That we say that you're not chayiv if the seller's not chayiv if you sold flaxseed. Ema Seifa. Now look at the end of that, where we say Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer Zro One Gina She'ena Nechalin Chaya B'achur Yusan. If you sell garden seeds which are not edible, then the seller would be liable. So Tanakama Nami Haki Kamer. 1 second, the Tanakama didn't disagree with that. So Zera Pishtan, who the Eno Chaya B'achur Yusan, the Tanakama only notes that flaxseed you're not liable for. So Hazro Unigina She'ena Nechalin Chaya B'achur Yusan. He would agree that you are liable if you try to sell garden seeds that are not edible and then they don't blossom. So what is the machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The machlokes must be Elolav Hotza Ika Benayu. Maybe the difference between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is whether or not you're liable for expenses. Mar savar demei zera, umar savar av hotza. The Tanakama would say you're liable just for the seeds themselves, meaning you have to return the money. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would say, no, you have to even pay for expenses. Mimai. Well, 1 second. How do you know that that's the case? Dilma ibcha. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the Tanakama would hold him liable for expenses, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel would say you're only liable for the seeds themselves. So halokasha, that's not really a possible explanation, because kol tana basra l'tfuye milsa kasi. Because whenever you've got an ordering in our Mishnah, the last opinion is adding something. So clearly, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel would be adding. There's liability for expenses, because ordinarily you wouldn't think that there would be liability for expenses. But maybe our entire Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. V'chasuri mechsera, and there's missing language. V'hakiktani, and this is how you should learn our Mishnah. Hamoker peres lechavero. If you sell produce to your friend uzra'an and they plant them below samcho and it doesn't blossom, afilu zera pishtan, even if it's flaxseed, eno chaya b'achur yusan, you're not liable for the seller's not liable for the loss. Okay, divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. That is what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says. She Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, because Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, again, we're going to delete all the language in parentheses. Zaroni gina she'ena ne'echalin chaya b'achur yusan. Because when it comes to garden seeds that are not edible, you're responsible for the loss, implying that garden seeds you are responsible, but flaxseed you're not responsible. Elaha Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So okay, so that can't be the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that shows that consequential damages are there's liability for it. So rather, it's got to be the following: Titania hamolachit and litchon. If you take wheat to a miller, velo tatan, and he doesn't actually wet the wheat before he grinds it. And therefore he ruins it and makes it v'asan subin umosran, and therefore mursan, and therefore he makes it into coarse bran or fine bran. He has blown the opportunity to create the valuable flour that you brought it to him to create. Kemach l'nachtom, or you bring flour to a baker, v'afo pas nipolin, and he bakes a terrible bread and it all falls apart. Behema l'tabach, or you bring an animal to a butcher, the nibla, and he causes it to become a nevela, so he's no longer kosher. Chayev. In all those cases, the tradesperson, the grinder, the baker, the butcher, they're all going to be liable for the damage. Because and the Gemara elsewhere where this Gemara is quoted actually says it's because he's a paid worker, and when you pay somebody to do a job, they take on the liability associated with doing a bad job. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, not only is the guy liable to give you back the original unprocessed, to pay you for the unprocessed input that you gave, but nosing lo demei boshto. You have to pay for the customer's embarrassment, because the person asked for bread to be baked or flour to be made or an animal to be shechted because he was going to invite people to his home to give them a meal. Udmei boshas orchav, and to the embarrassment of the guests. Now everybody's embarrassed at the terrible food that's being offered. So as a result, there's a loss that's associated with that. So Rebbe Shimon ben Gamliel is clearly saying that if in fact there's a consequential loss, you're liable for it. And so certainly you'll be liable for the money that you spend on these bad seeds. The Kain Haya Rebbe Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, and Rebbe Shimon ben Gamliel said another statement that shows that there's liability for consequential damages. Mina gadol haya b'Yerushalayim. There was a great custom in Yerushalayim. Hamoser suda lechavero. If you give over to another person the making of a meal, the kilkala, and the caterer ruins it. No saying lo dmei bashto. You have to. The caterer not only has to pay for the underlying food, but he has to pay for the embarrassment. Udmei boshes orchav, and for the embarrassment of his guests. And essentially, what we're saying is that this is not actually strictly required by law, but rather it is effectively a takana to help avoid and ensure proper functioning of the marketplace. Meaning sometimes you need penalties in order to help the functioning of the marketplace. And now, just by the way, there's another great custom that was in Yerushalayim, mapa prusa al gabi hapasach, that people would spread out some kind of cloth above their door. Kolzman shemapa prusa orkin nichnasin, and that would tell people who are walking in the street, you want to come in for a meal, feel free to come in for a meal. Nistalka mapa mapa, but if you take away that cloth, then guests would know not to come in, because of course they would know they're not interested in that you don't have the food necessary to feed them. So we will pick up, God willing, from the Mishnah. My apologies for not scrolling. Let me just pause for a moment here. And we will pick up from the Mishnah, God willing, tomorrow. The Mishnah continues the topic that we've been looking at of generic transactions, and asks the question, how much inferior product? This is something that like the FDA does all the time, right? Yeah, if you go on the FDA's website, I think it's the FDA, you can find out like how much bugs are allowed in flour in order to be sellable. How much of various impurities are allowed in various products. So that's the topic that we're going to be dealing with, God willing, tomorrow.
Did we conclude here whether we follow achar arov for according to Rav, or lo as leaning achar arov kamo Shmuel?
Excellent question. So in the end, we've said that the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel is a machlokas Tanaim. But the bottom line is that when it comes to the machlokot between Rav and Shmuel, we follow Rav be'isurin and Shmuel be'dinei, and meaning we follow Rav when it comes to things that are prohibited, and Shmuel with respect to monetary matters. This is a monetary matter, and so as a result, we follow Shmuel, that we do not follow the Rov when it comes to monetary matters. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and look forward to picking up tomorrow. My apologies for this being such a long daf. I'm looking forward to continuing.
Well, it's long, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
But we didn't say.
Yeah.
It was Rav. We know that is the. I remember learning that Shmuel bedine mamanot and Rav be isurim, but the Gemara didn't state.
Didn't state that here, no.
They didn't state it here.
But I'm telling you that when it comes to, if you take a look in the halachic sources, we follow Shmuel in this situation. Ein hochen achar rov b'mamo. All right. Have a great day. See you tomorrow, God willing.